The picturesque town of Elderbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of the Ozarks, had always prided itself on its close-knit community and old-world charm. With its Victorian-era buildings and quaint Main Street, it was a place where time seemed to move a little slower, where neighbors still knew each other by name, and where scandal was as rare as a snowfall in July. But in the spring of 2022, this idyllic haven would become the backdrop for a series of crimes so shocking, so utterly at odds with its peaceful facade, that it would forever change the way the people of Elderbrook viewed their town and each other. At the center of this dark tale was Penelope Thornfield, a 24-year-old bride whose delicate features and soft-spoken demeanor belied a cunning mind and a heart capable of unfathomable cruelty. Penelope had come to Elderbrook just 2 years earlier, a transplant from the bustling city of St. Louis. She quickly captured the attention of the town's eligible bachelors, but it was Maxwell Green, son of Elderbrook's wealthiest family and owner of the local pharmacy, who ultimately won her hand. Their wedding, held in the town's historic St. Agnes Church, was the social event of the year. The entire community turned out to witness the union of the charming newcomer and their hometown golden boy. As Penelope glided down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her auburn hair adorned with baby's breath, not a soul in attendance could have imagined the darkness that lurked behind her serene smile. The first hint of trouble came just 3 months after the wedding. Maxwell's grandmother, Beatrice Green, a spirited octogenarian known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue, fell suddenly ill. At first, the symptoms seemed innocuous enough: nausea, dizziness, fatigue. But within days, Beatrice's condition had deteriorated rapidly. She was rushed to Elderbrook General Hospital, where puzzled doctors struggled to identify the cause of her mysterious ailment. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a young but brilliant toxicologist who had recently joined the hospital staff, was the first to suspect foul play. The symptoms are consistent with heavy metal poisoning, she confided to her colleague, Dr. James Harper, as they pored over Beatrice's lab results. But I can't imagine how she could have been exposed to such high levels accidentally. As Beatrice lay dying in the ICU, her family gathered around her bedside. Maxwell, his face etched with grief, held his grandmother's frail hand. Penelope stood by his side, a pillar of support, her eyes brimming with what appeared to be genuine tears. "She was always so kind to me," Penelope whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I can't believe this is happening." Beatrice Green passed away 5 days after being admitted to the hospital. The official cause of death was listed as acute renal failure, but Dr. Ramirez couldn't shake her suspicions. She ordered a comprehensive toxicology screen, but by the time the results came back confirming the presence of arsenic in Beatrice's system, the body had already been cremated, in accordance with the family's wishes. The death of Beatrice Green might have remained nothing more than a tragic mystery, were it not for the events that unfolded in the months that followed. Just 6 weeks after Beatrice's funeral, Maxwell's father, Richard Green, began experiencing similar symptoms. Once again, Penelope was a constant presence at the hospital, tending to her father-in-law with seemingly tireless devotion. This time, however, Dr. Ramirez was prepared. She immediately ordered a toxicology screen, which confirmed her worst fears. Richard Green was suffering from arsenic poisoning. Despite aggressive treatment, Richard succumbed to the poison, leaving the Green family and the entire town of Elderbrook reeling from the second tragedy in as many months. It was at this point that the Elderbrook Police Department, led by Chief Detective Marcus Holloway, began to take a closer look at the Green family deaths. Holloway, a 20-year veteran of the force with a reputation for dogged determination, sensed that there was more to these deaths than mere coincidence. 2 members of the same family, dying of arsenic poisoning within months of each other. Holloway mused to his partner, Detective Sarah Chen, as they sat in his cluttered office. "That's not bad luck. That's murder." As the investigation began in earnest, a portrait of Penelope Thornfield began to emerge that was at odds with her public persona. Interviews with her former colleagues and acquaintances in St. Louis painted a picture of a woman who was ambitious to a fault, with a history of latching onto wealthy men and a knack for ingratiating herself with their families. But it was Penelope's past, meticulously uncovered by Detective Chen, that provided the first real breakthrough in the case. She was married before, Chen reported, her voice tight with excitement. 3 years ago, in Kansas City, to a man named Edward Hartley. Wealthy family, old money. He died just 6 months after the wedding. Cause of death: acute renal failure. The parallels were too striking to ignore. Holloway immediately reached out to the Kansas City Police Department, requesting all files related to Edward Hartley's death. As they waited for the records to arrive, the detectives continued to build their case, piecing together a timeline of Penelope's movements and interactions with the Green family. Meanwhile, unaware that she was now the focus of a murder investigation, Penelope continued to play the role of the grieving daughter-in-law to perfection. She organized a charity fundraiser in Richard's memory, donated generously to the hospital where he had spent his final days, and was frequently seen comforting her husband as he struggled to come to terms with the loss of his father and grandmother. But beneath her caring exterior, Penelope was growing increasingly anxious. The unexpected scrutiny from Dr. Ramirez and the frequent visits from Detectives Holloway and Chen had not gone unnoticed. She knew she needed to act quickly if she was to secure her position in the Green family, and claim the inheritance she believed was rightfully hers. It was this growing desperation that would lead Penelope to make her gravest mistake, one that would ultimately be her undoing. On a crisp autumn evening, as the leaves in Elderbrook began to turn golden and red, Penelope paid a visit to her mother-in-law, Evelyn Green. Evelyn, still deep in mourning for her husband, welcomed Penelope with open arms. The two women sat in Evelyn's sunroom, sipping tea and reminiscing about Richard. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn began to feel unwell. "It's probably just grief," Penelope soothed, helping her mother-in-law to bed. "Why don't you rest? I'll check on you in the morning." But Evelyn Green would never see another morning. When Maxwell arrived at his mother's house the next day, he found her cold and unresponsive in her bed. Penelope, who had arrived just moments before, was hysterical. "I should have stayed with her," she sobbed into her husband's chest. "I should have known something was wrong." For the people of Elderbrook, the death of Evelyn Green was the final straw. Whispers of a curse on the Green family began to circulate. Some even spoke of a malevolent spirit, targeting the town's most prominent citizens. But for Detective Holloway and Dr. Ramirez, Evelyn's death was the piece of the puzzle they had been waiting for. 3 deaths, all in the same family, all with the same symptoms, Holloway said grimly as he stood over Evelyn's body in the hospital morgue. "This isn't a coincidence, and it damn sure isn't a curse. This is cold-blooded murder." Dr. Ramirez nodded, her face pale but determined. "I've already started the toxicology screen. If it's arsenic again, we'll have our proof." As they waited for the test results, Holloway and Chen delved deeper into Penelope's past. The records from Kansas City had finally arrived, and they painted a damning picture. Edward Hartley's death had indeed been caused by arsenic poisoning, though it had been attributed to accidental exposure at the time. More disturbingly, they uncovered evidence of 2 other deaths connected to Penelope: an elderly aunt who had left her a small inheritance, and a former boyfriend's father who had opposed their relationship. Both had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths attributed to natural causes. "But she's been at this for years," Chen said, her voice filled with a mix of horror and grudging admiration. "Moving from city to city, changing her name slightly each time. She's like a black widow, spinning her web and drawing her victims in." Holloway leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed in thought. But why the Green family? Why here in Elderbrook? The answer to that question would come from an unexpected source. Maxwell Green, racked with grief and growing increasingly suspicious of his wife's behavior, had begun to do some digging of his own. He discovered a series of emails between Penelope and a man named James Thornfield, her real father. It turned out not the kindly widower she had introduced as her dad at their wedding. The emails revealed a chilling conspiracy. James Thornfield, it seemed, was a failed businessman with a mountain of debt and a bitter grudge against society. He had raised his daughter to be his instrument of revenge against the wealthy elites he blamed for his misfortunes. Penelope was not just a murderer, she was a carefully crafted weapon, honed since childhood to infiltrate wealthy families and destroy them from within. Armed with this new information and the toxicology results confirming arsenic poisoning in Evelyn Green's death, Holloway knew it was time to act. But Penelope, sensing the net closing around her, had one final, desperate move to make. On a stormy night in late October, as lightning illuminated the Victorian spires of Elderbrook, Penelope prepared for her endgame. She had invited Maxwell to a private dinner at their home, promising to explain everything. As her unsuspecting husband sipped the wine she had carefully laced with a lethal dose of arsenic, Penelope finally allowed her mask to slip. "You were never supposed to be anything more than a means to an end," she told him, her voice cold and devoid of the warmth it had held for the past 2 years. "Your family's money, your position in this town, that's all I ever wanted. It's all I was raised to want." Maxwell, already feeling the effects of the poison, stared at his wife in horror and disbelief. Why, he managed to gasp, "Why us? Why me?" Penelope's laugh was hollow, tinged with a madness born of a lifetime of manipulation and deceit. "Why not? Your family, with all its wealth and respectability, represented everything my father taught me to hate. Breaking you apart from the inside, watching you crumble, it was exhilarating." But even as Penelope savored her moment of triumph, fate intervened. A loud crash echoed through the house as the front door was kicked in. Detective Holloway, acting on a hunch and a growing sense of urgency, had decided to make his move. Penelope Thornfield, Holloway's voice boomed through the house, "You're under arrest for the murders of Beatrice, Richard, and Evelyn Green." And in the chaos that followed, as Penelope was tackled to the ground by Detective Chen and Maxwell was rushed to the hospital, the full extent of the young bride's poisoning spree was finally laid bare. The people of Elderbrook, gathered in shocked clusters on the rain-soaked street outside the Green Mansion, struggled to comprehend the evil that had been living in their midst. In the days and weeks that followed, as Maxwell fought for his life in the hospital and eventually recovered, the story of Penelope Thornfield dominated national headlines. Her trial, held in the county courthouse the following spring, drew media attention from across the country. Prosecutors painted a damning picture of a remorseless killer, methodically working her way through the Green family in pursuit of their fortune. Penelope's own emails to her father were entered into evidence, revealing the cold calculation behind her actions. The defense, grasping at straws, attempted to portray Penelope as a victim herself, a child warped by a mentally ill father, conditioned from birth to carry out his twisted vendetta. But the jury, composed of 12 men and women from Elderbrook and the surrounding towns, was unmoved by this argument. After just 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with their verdict guilty on all counts. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility, sentenced Penelope to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Penelope was led from the courtroom in shackles, her face a mask of cold defiance, the people of Elderbrook struggled to reconcile the woman they had welcomed into their community with the monster she had been revealed to be. How could they have been so thoroughly deceived? How could such evil have hidden behind such a benign facade? In the years that followed, Elderbrook would slowly begin to heal. The Green family, under Maxwell's leadership, established a foundation in memory of Beatrice, Richard, and Evelyn, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and raising awareness about the insidious nature of poisoning crimes. Dr. Ramirez, hailed as a hero for her role in uncovering the truth, went on to become a leading expert in forensic toxicology, her experience in the Thornfield case informing her work and teaching for decades to come. Detective Holloway, haunted by the case and the knowledge of how close Penelope had come to escaping justice, dedicated the remainder of his career to investigating cold cases, determined to bring closure to families still searching for answers. And in a maximum security prison, Penelope Thornfield sat in her cell, her youthful beauty fading with each passing year. She received no visitors, wrote no letters of remorse. The only communication she maintained was with her father, until his death 5 years into her sentence. As for the town of Elderbrook, it would never quite be the same. The sense of safety and innocence that had once been its hallmark was gone, replaced by a wary vigilance. Newcomers to the town were viewed with a suspicion that would have been unthinkable before the Thornfield case. Yet, in time, a new normalcy emerged. The story of the young bride's poisoning spree became a cautionary tale whispered about on front porches and over fences. It served as a grim reminder that evil can wear the most beautiful of masks, and that trust, once broken, is not easily regained. 30 years after the events that shook Elderbrook to its core, a journalist named Mara Winters arrived in town, intent on writing a book about the Thornfield case. As she interviewed the aging residents who had lived through those terrible months, she was struck by the lasting impact of Penelope's crimes. It wasn't just the Green family she poisoned, one elderly woman told Mara, her rheumy eyes filled with a sadness that had never quite faded. She poisoned our whole way of life. We used to leave our doors unlocked, you know, used to think we could spot a bad apple from a mile away. Now we know better. Now we know that sometimes evil comes with a smile and a home-baked pie. Mara's book, when it was published, became an instant bestseller. The Elderbrook Poisoner, a true story of beauty, betrayal, and murder, reignited national interest in the case. True crime enthusiasts debated the nature vs. nurture aspects of Penelope's upbringing. Armchair detectives pored over the details of the investigation, looking for missed clues or unexplored angles. But for the people of Elderbrook, the renewed attention was an unwelcome reminder of the darkness that had once touched their lives. They had moved on as best they could, building new traditions and forging new bonds of trust. The annual Elderbrook Festival, once a quaint celebration of the town's history, had been transformed into a community-wide event focused on fostering connections between neighbors old and new. But Maxwell Green, now in his 60s and long remarried, remained a pillar of the community. The pharmacy he had inherited from his father had grown into a small chain, and his charitable foundation had helped countless families affected by domestic violence. When approached by Mara for an interview, he had declined politely but firmly. "The past is the past," he was reported to have said. "We honor the memory of those we lost by living good lives and taking care of each other. That's all any of us can do." In her cell, Penelope Thornfield watched a news segment about the book's release with detached interest. Her auburn hair had long since faded to gray, her once smooth skin now lined with the passage of years. As the reporter recounted the details of her crimes, a small, cold smile played across her lips. "They still don't understand," she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse from disuse. It was never about the money. It was about the game. Indeed, as the years passed and Penelope's notoriety faded, the true complexity of her motives remained a subject of debate among criminologists and psychologists. Some argued that she was a classic sociopath, incapable of empathy and driven solely by self-interest. Others saw in her crimes the twisted logic of a mind warped by years of paternal manipulation. Dr. Amelia Patel, a forensic psychologist who had conducted several interviews with Penelope over the years, offered perhaps the most chilling assessment. "What we're dealing with here is a perfect storm of nature and nurture," she explained in a TED Talk that went viral. Penelope Thornfield was born with a predisposition towards antisocial behavior, but it was her father's influence that honed that predisposition into a weapon. She doesn't just lack empathy, she sees the pain of others as a form of validation. Each successful deception, each life destroyed, was proof of her superiority. This insight into Penelope's psyche only served to deepen the sense of betrayal felt by those who had known her in Elderbrook. Clara Simmons, who had been Penelope's maid of honor at her wedding to Maxwell, spoke of the lingering trauma in a local newspaper interview. "For years after, I couldn't trust my own judgment," Clara admitted, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I kept thinking, if I could be so wrong about Penelope, what else might I be wrong about? Who else in my life might be wearing a mask?" Clara's experience was far from unique. In the decades following Penelope's arrest, Elderbrook saw a marked increase in mental health issues among its residents. The local psychiatrist, Dr. Henry Oakes, found his practice overwhelmed with patients suffering from anxiety, paranoia, and trust issues. What Penelope Thornfield did to this town goes far beyond the individuals she murdered, Dr. Oakes explained. She shattered our collective sense of security, our belief in the fundamental goodness of our neighbors. Rebuilding that trust has been a long, slow process. Yet, even as Elderbrook struggled to heal, there were those who sought to exploit the town's dark history. Ghost tours sprang up, offering visitors the chance to see the sites associated with Penelope's crimes. True crime podcasts devoted entire seasons to dissecting every aspect of the case. There was even talk of a Hollywood movie, though the project was ultimately shelved due to pushback from the victims' families. Through it all, Penelope Thornfield remained an enigma. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs. The only glimpses into her mind came from the heavily redacted reports of the prison psychiatrists who evaluated her regularly. One such report, leaked to the press on the 20th anniversary of her conviction, painted a disturbing picture of a woman who felt no remorse for her actions. "Subject continues to display a marked lack of empathy," the report read. When questioned about the impact of her actions on the victims' families, she responded with visible irritation, stating, "They should be thanking me. I made them interesting." This callous statement reignited public interest in the case and led to renewed calls for a deeper investigation into Penelope's past. Detective Sarah Chen, now the chief of police in Elderbrook, found herself fielding calls from law enforcement agencies across the country, all wondering if unsolved poisoning cases in their jurisdictions might be linked to Penelope. "We know she was active for years before she came to Elderbrook," Chen explained in a press conference. "It's entirely possible that there are other victims out there, other families who never got closure. We owe it to them to keep digging." Chen's words would prove prophetic. In the spring of 2052, 30 years after Penelope's conviction, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A genealogy website, cross-referencing DNA samples from cold cases with their vast database, found a familial match to evidence collected from an unsolved poisoning case in Oregon dating back to 2015. The victim, a 68-year-old retired teacher named Margaret Hollister, had died of apparent arsenic poisoning shortly after befriending a young woman who had moved in next door. The woman, who had identified herself as Penelope Summers, had vanished shortly after Margaret's death, leaving no trace behind. This new revelation sent shockwaves through the true crime community and reignited media interest in Penelope Thornfield. Journalists descended once again on Elderbrook, much to the chagrin of its residents. Maxwell Green, now in his twilight years, issued a brief statement through his foundation. "While we are saddened to learn of another life possibly lost to this woman's cruelty, we hope that this new information might bring some measure of closure to the Hollister family. Our thoughts are with them, and with all those who have been touched by this tragedy." For Detective Chen, now on the verge of retirement herself, the new lead represented both a challenge and an opportunity. "We always suspected there were more victims," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of years spent pursuing justice. "Now we have proof. It's our duty to follow this as far as it goes, to give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves." As the investigation into Margaret Hollister's death progressed, more potential victims came to light. A college student in Florida who died under mysterious circumstances in 2013. a wealthy widow in Texas whose sudden death in 2014 had been attributed to heart failure. In each case, a young woman matching Penelope's description had been peripherally involved, only to disappear shortly after the death. The full extent of Penelope Thornfield's crimes may never be known. Many of the deaths attributed to her occurred years ago, with evidence long since degraded or destroyed. But for the families of her suspected victims, the renewed investigation offered a glimmer of hope, a chance, at last, for answers. In Elderbrook, the new revelations were met with a mix of resignation and grim determination. The town had long since come to terms with its dark chapter, but the knowledge that Penelope's trail of destruction extended far beyond their borders brought a fresh wave of guilt and introspection. "We can't change the past," Mayor Lily Chen, Sarah's daughter, said in a town hall meeting. "But we can honor the victims, all of them, by continuing to build a community based on trust, transparency, and mutual support." Penelope Thornfield tried to poison our faith in each other. We prove her wrong every day we come together as neighbors and friends. As for Penelope herself, the new investigation seemed to awaken something in her. After years of silence, she suddenly requested a meeting with Detective Chen. In a stark prison visiting room, the two women faced each other across a scarred metal table. Penelope, her once vibrant beauty long faded, regarded Chen with cold amusement. "I suppose you want a confession," she said, her voice raspy from years of disuse. Chen met her gaze steadily. "I want the truth. For the families. They deserve that much." A slow smile spread across Penelope's face. "The truth. The truth is, Detective, that I gave those people the most exciting moments of their dull, insignificant lives. I made them part of something greater than themselves. Isn't that what everyone wants in the end? To be remembered." Chen felt a chill run down her spine at the utter lack of remorse in Penelope's voice. "They deserve to live," she said quietly, "to grow old, to be with their families. You stole that from them." Penelope leaned back in her chair, her chains clinking softly. "I gave them immortality. As long as people talk about me, they'll talk about them too. We're bound together for eternity." Her smile widened, showing teeth that had yellowed with age. "And now you're part of it too, Detective Chen. How does it feel to be a chapter in my story?" Chen stood abruptly, unable to bear another moment in Penelope's presence. As she turned to leave, Penelope called after her. "You'll never know all of it, you know. There will always be secrets, always be doubts. That's my final gift to you all." As Chen left the prison, she felt a weight settle onto her shoulders. She knew that Penelope was right. They would likely never know the full extent of her crimes. But she also knew that they had to try, for the sake of the victims and their families. In the years that followed, the investigation into Penelope Thornfield's past would continue, uncovering new victims and bringing a measure of closure to families who had lived for years with unanswered questions. Books would be written, documentaries filmed, all attempting to understand the mind of a woman who had turned murder into an art form. But for the people of Elderbrook, life went on. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bonds tested and ultimately reinforced by shared trauma. The town became known not for the horrors of its past, but for its resilience, its commitment to community, and its unwavering support for victims of domestic violence and abuse. On the 50th anniversary of Penelope's arrest, a new memorial was unveiled in Elderbrook's Central Park. It was a simple granite obelisk, engraved not with Penelope's name, but with the names of all her known victims from Beatrice Green to Margaret Hollister and beyond. At the base of the monument, a plaque bore a simple inscription, "And in memory of those lost, may their stories remind us to cherish our connections, to look out for one another, and to never again let evil hide behind a friendly face." As the sun set on that solemn day of remembrance, the people of Elderbrook joined hands around the monument, a living circle of hope and defiance. They had survived Penelope Thornfield's poisonous legacy, and in doing so had forged a community stronger than she could ever have imagined. And in her prison cell, Now in her twilight years, Penelope Thornfield sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of her victims and the fading echoes of her notoriety. She had sought to make her mark on the world through death and deception, but in the end, her greatest legacy was the resilience of those she had sought to destroy. The young bride's poisoning spree had indeed left multiple dead, but it had failed to kill the one thing she had truly targeted: the human capacity for trust, for love, and for healing. In Elderbrook and beyond, life went on, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness.